Well, welcome everyone to the first session. This is a really happy day for me, at least, and for the team to have our first office hours session. Today is Monday, November 22, and remember that the office hours is space that it's pretty much established in the open source yeah, in the open source project. And the goal is mainly to have again an open communication path with the community to answer tough questions, let's say, and also to discuss ideas in both ways. So right now we have designed this space to have here conversations that could potentially change the architecture of the project, or at least how some things are done by Cartographer in the form of RFCs. The RFCs are the process or the method that the team has adopted to propose ideas, and this is the space to discuss them. Right, so the agenda again is completely open. We have some discussion topics here. I see 5 discussion topics. So if we are to follow the the kind of rules of engagement for this kind of meetings, we will have 12 minutes per discussion item.
I'm going to drop
Let's see
one.
how this works.
Sorry, I'm going to drop mine, David.
Okay.
Yep, it's something that we're going to have to handle a little bit more sooner, and then we can delay the rest of the discussion. So you've got a little bit more time for all the others.
Oh, okay, Rush, thank you. Yeah, so we will have kind of 15 minutes per topic. We're not using any tool to track the actual time for each one of the discussion, but let's say that we are kind of time boxing it so everyone can chime in each one of the 4 discussion topics for today's session, right? So that's it. The role is to rotate again the note-taking role. For today, the lucky winner is Josh. Thank you for that. And I don't know if Josh, could you share your screen with the meeting notes? That will make it easier. Thank you. So let's get started. RFC 15 forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I dropped this in. There's been discussion in the pull request. I think Stephen incorporated some suggestions from others. I think it looks good. We had a discussion today about putting a little more information in there as well, and I'm planning to add a comment to that effect. But it's not clear to me what we are to do now, because the person who opened this RFC is not on our team and hasn't taken any action on it. And being on the team, I would like to move this forward. So I don't want to be blocked on somebody who has like other concerns. So I don't know what we want to do.
Have you spoken to them or able to ping them in the Slack channel maybe?
Yeah, I already pinged him several days
Nothing.
ago. A couple of times, no response yet.
So is it you're just looking for feedback on the pull request if this satisfies the RFC? Yeah.
Well, we don't. There hasn't been. Yeah, like essentially, I'd like to know. I'd like to take the updated suggestion here and make it part of the RFC, and then we could have I think then we could have an up or down Roman vote, and I suspect that we would say yes, let's do this. And my concern is that, yeah, like if the author of this RFC is like, I raised an issue with you, and I just want you guys to figure it out. I think that's totally. I think it's totally fine for someone to come with us with a problem, and we should be able to to say like, oh yeah, thanks for kicking us down this road, and we'll take it from here. I don't know if that means just opening up a new RFC that like covers the same ground, and then we ask them to withdraw the RFC 14 in favor of RFC 17 or whatever it would be. That's probably the where I would go.
Can't we augment the branch? Is there any reason not to just keep augmenting the branch?
It's a private fork.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we can still merge it to another branch on VMware Tanzu. We don't have to merge it to main, and then it's ours.
I think
and then we,
I mean,
if
but
we have
I
like
think it's
states,
essentially what Washuma's saying, right? It's just we just need to take this over.
I just don't think we should renumber
whatever
it.
the technical mechanism for doing that.
It'll have history, so let's just not bother renaming, is my point. Right?
Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, I think basically from other conversations I've had with Paul, I think let's confirm with him, but I think he'd probably be fine with us taking this over and just running with it. So let's confirm that that's the case, and then we can move forward with it.
and if you're using the state diagram that you shared last time with Shuma from I think Python, that this would be the case of the superseded, where like, yeah, this one was abandoned, we picked up, now that one is superseded by this. If we want to generate a new number, otherwise, like Rash said, we can just use the same number, close this one, put the other one up.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if it's possible to keep the state of this PR with a new branch. But yeah, otherwise, I think it. Yeah, right now I'm thinking along the same lines that you mentioned, Sarah. So it sounds like the action item is Josh is going to ask Paul if he minds us like rewriting and moving forward.
I guess being the note taker, I should write that down. Section for action items.
Okay, yeah, you can just put it there, and then I'll make sure that it's organized and table and all of it.
Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts or opinions about this, the updated suggestion? Has anyone looked at this at all?
I was just gonna say I'm yes, I'm a thumbs up on it. And then the only thing that I would add to this was what we were discussing today, augmenting this with one more field that is the actual resource, the actual object that could be pulled on Kubernetes that would say like, this is the object that this artifact came from.
Right,
What do you
because we're
mean?
saying that this past resource names is a reference to the name that we give it in the workload or in the supply chain, sorry, and isn't immediately discoverable from someone who's only looking at the workload or things in their namespace.
Yeah, if they didn't have access to read the supply chain, they would have no idea what that information is referring to.
So you're saying copying in the entire object here?
Not the object, but the name, namespace, API version, and kind.
Right. Okay, cool. An identity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because like just for reference, right? This is what it looks like right now, which is again just the name that we give it in the supply chain.
So I could be derpy here, but would we also want the resource version? Or observed generation? I think resource version standard, so that's what we need. I think
Not
that would be
resource
good.
version, I would say. 'Cause that's just for the concurrency control. Probably the generation.
Well, not everything has observed generations, right? Oh, it has generations though. Metadata has generations.
No, it
No,
doesn't.
so
Yeah.
resource version. Because it will still refer to a version of the resource that was committed and seen. It's not just for concurrency, it's also the version of the object that was stored in Etsy.
Can one, actually that might maybe even better. I was about to say, can one observed generation represent more than one resource version? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And that speaks more strongly that it should be the resource version.
Yeah.
Because, for example, KPack, if the build store changes, the observed generation will not change, but the resource version presumably would. And so that would.
But I think you can't rely on it. Like as far as I remember, there's no guarantee that it will never collide with something from the past. So like the guarantees that it has make it so it's not a great use for this. I think, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe even Rawlings.
Isn't it the key
know better.
to etcd? I mean, like, isn't the
Yeah.
resource version unique? Like, isn't it something you can rely on?
You've got to have something, or it's not a very good versioned resource store, right? Let's look into it.
I believe it's the key for etcd. So
All right. So
I mean, the bottom line is, I think we want to be able to say it was this thing at this point in time, right? As it looked here. And I thought resource version would be the most obvious way that you could fetch that if it was still not garbage collected. I don't know what garbage collection looks like in the back end of a kube server, but I would think, text documents are fairly lightweight. I'm hoping they're kept for quite a while, but I could be wrong about that too. Cool.
Cool. Anything else on this one before we move on? All right. New RFC 16.
no comments yet, so it probably is best to. Oh, did I link the wrong thing?
It looks right. What do you
Oh,
mean
yeah.
the wrong
If you-
RFC?
No, they're wrong RFC, but I find this, I don't like reading regular Markdown. I guess you can click to view the.
It took me straight to it, so I don't know.
I think Josh did not click on that link.
No, I opened it before you had linked it. Sorry.
All right.
Yeah. The link is working. It's beautiful.
Magic of the internet. Shumat, do you want to talk about your thing?
Yeah, right now, when we read a value off of so yeah, you use a template, a source template, to wrap some object. And if you look at our tests, you'll see that like we just accept anything. When you say like URL field, revision field, we're like, you can put anything in there. It could be it could be a whole JSON object that you use as your URL. And I think that we should, you know, if somebody misconfigured and did that in their external supply chain, eventually we presume that they would hit an error when they were stamping some later object. And they would get some error message about like, well, I couldn't stamp this. And they'd have to like trace back and figure out like what's the problem. And I think it would make a lot more sense for us to just actually do some validation of when we read a value off of a templated object and we say, oh, I'm going to put this into an image. I'm going to expose this to later resources as an image value. We should do some validation that that is actually reasonable. The smallest bit of validation would be just making sure that they're the right types, so that a source URL and revision are strings, an image is a string, and a config is some JSON object. And stronger guarantees would be, I don't actually know what constitutes a valid image hash, but yeah, figuring that out.
I just thought configs were any string, because it could be multi-YAML doc, or it could be like I thought that was by design, that these didn't have to be a valid JSON object, for example. They could be multi-docs, for example. I think that's even what we do today.
Yeah, fair enough.
Just something that you triggered in my head. I'm like, I'm not sure it's as validatable as you think. That one, the others definitely. Yeah.
I guess I don't have a problem with trying to add validation. I don't know if I would have thought this is an RFC. If we wanted to just add validation, that seems like something that could have just been an issue.
I hope that means that it gets accepted very quickly. And
yeah, I'm asking because like I want to make sure, you know, like I'm trying not to.
I think I get Washima's position, though. This is probably a design decision or two here. That is to start saying that these things really are of particular types. All right.
It's a breaking change, which is supposed to be an RFC, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Per hour governance or contributing doc.
I don't think you'll find pushback on validation, right? So looks good to me.
Yeah, let's just make sure we get it right. That's the thing, right? I think at the moment configs are considered to be any old string that can be serialized in many, many ways, including I have heard people bandy around the idea that it could just be a string. Like it could just be a config template, could be a thing that gives you like a secret, not a secret object, just the value of a secret, for example. These are all things that leave Cartographer somewhat flexible, whereas the others are quite specific. And it makes a lot of sense to me that like an image should at least meet URL spec, same as this source URL should meet URL spec.
So here's my question. Should we have like config, because I've definitely had in my mind, config is a K8s object. That's what it's meant to be. Should we create a fifth template type that is this arbitrary template type that can be anything that we don't validate?
Well, let's just start by checking an assumption that I have, which is I think a lot of people are putting in multi-doc YAML in config. I thought one of the OOTBs does that today.
Mhm.
Because basically it's a lot of objects. It's not a config map that it spits out. It is a collection of like opinions about the objects you'll need to create to set up your application effectively.
Mhm.
Is that
So
true today?
not really.
No?
In
Okay.
those ones, we're like creating config map and then passing as config the data field. So we're
Oh.
passing a map of,
So we're wrapping it somewhere.
yeah, because then like the key is the name of the file and then the content is the content, right? So that's a way of passing multiple files essentially.
Yeah, it's a way of passing multiple files. It's something that must be committed to Kubernetes at some point to be consumed, right? Or there might be some magic template. I still feel like there was something during our last pass at standard template as like some default templates where putting this stuff across the wire didn't necessarily mean that someone wanted to see a config map, but because that became specific to then whatever deployment process you use must know how to read that config map versus it's just handed a generated config. All right, but maybe the output for that type is image, and that's the one we should be using because images can be used as a list of files. And that's why it doesn't have to be answered today, but I think there's risk around config. Yeah,
Mhm.
because I felt like I saw some stuff that doesn't comply with your idea of it being an object.
Well, and I think it's, I'm totally fine having an object that, or having a template type that's just sort of like, yeah, there's an arbitrary template type. I just wonder, do we want to have config be, this thing's a, what you stamp out in this is meant to be a valid K8s object. And if something's gone wrong and it's not a valid K8s object, we'll let you know.
It may be true.
Is there value for that? Yeah.
I think there's value if that's the intended design. I'm only questioning the intended design, not whether there's value in validating the intended design. If that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess how do we poke that question that you're asking, if that's the intended design?
I think we reach out to the users we know who are currently using the system for configs in complex ways for delivery and just see what the shape of that's looking like. And if I'm wrong, then assume that it can just be a valid K8s object and validate on that. Worst case scenario, it means a bunch of people are going, oh my God, this is not going to work for me when I move up to the next version. And we'll either give them a new solution or we'll backtrack.
Yeah, I think even if we found folks that are using it the way that you're saying, I would be with this story, I would be saying like, okay, we're gonna have a breaking change. You're gonna have to use this other arbitrary template type.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is worth first finding out, would we need to have those conversations with anyone anyway? So.
Yeah, I swear I've seen it. I just can't remember where I think I've seen it. So I'll start with me. I'll see if I can go and find the examples that I thought I saw.
Thanks.
Cool. Anything else for this one?
Do we? I suppose, I guess my assumption from this discussion is that we will write a story and then we'll leave it up to the pair that picks it up to figure out what represents a valid image reference beyond it just being a string. And
sounds good.
Cool.
But I do have one other question for this one. Your RFC does not read like what you proposed. It reads like there could be a multitude of things that we need to check, right? Could we at least have the concrete examples very clearly called out? .image should be an image URL, unless I'm not looking at the right document. but have something concrete about what you're asking for. And then is there further scope that you care about other than inputs, or sorry, output selectors, which is I think what you're talking about right now, that output selectors are selecting for something that's of a valid type, right?
Mhm.
Is there further scope than that you would like to add to this?
No, that was what I had in mind. I did not have anything else in mind.
You can just make it clear that that's all this needs to cover, and then we can say that it's implemented.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Neat. RFC 15. Supply chain selection with traits. Right. So this one, I think we actually had a few follow-up suggestions from the last time we talked about this in our community meeting.
One update is that I've put a reference implementation of the first. I remember that this RFC has like true suggestions, or it talks about true use cases. I don't remember exactly, but one was literally like, oh, what if we had our selectors allowing for multiple fields in the map, and then our workloads performed this best label matching thing. There's an open PR about it. Sorry, I'm really like hazy on the details.
No, you're right.
It's been a
So there
bit.
was two suggestions. One was, and they could be either or, and one was to actually have labels that select meaningfully, and then inferred selection based on fields being present that meant a thing. And I think we had decided at the time that the only thing that had to happen anytime soon was the first. So that's exciting. I think at the should I just land this document and tidy it up? I had asked Josh to do it. I think he didn't have the time in the end. So
Yeah.
are we calling this ratified then at this point?
It looked pretty nice to me.
Right. I'll do that. Yay, I finally got one on the main line.
There you go.
Of course, it wasn't mine. It was Josh's
Yeah,
originally.
you were writing it up for Josh.
I know. Whatever.
Awesome. Thanks, Rash.
I dropped in a note that pointed out that so there were the two strategies that Rash talked about, characteristics and then features. And that features option looks a lot like the fallback strategy that's discussed in RFC 9. It's talking about falling back. It points out that we could have resources where you define not one template, but multiple templates. And we just say like, oh, if you try to fulfill template 1 and it doesn't work, then you could just fall back to template 2. And if template 2 doesn't work, then you could fall back to template 3. We've kind of obviated we've sidestepped the need for that sort of strategy with our use of YTT templating. But yeah, I thought it was interesting to see.
They're also not
sort of
identical,
like,
right? Because this is about selecting a supply chain. So the idea is the supply chain specifies the templates, and then we kind of fall back. So it's moving the fallback up the list. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I agree.
All right. So you're not worried about it being a collision? Should I maybe just make sure I mentioned that this obviates that solution at this point?
I don't know that it's obvious, but well, let me take a step back. In the RFC, are you cleaning it up and saying that we're going to do both approaches, or that we're going to do the characteristics approach?
I believe that we agree that both are valuable. I don't know whether that's changed since we last talked about it.
Mhm.
We just thought the first one to implement was the characteristics one, because that would totally get us over the line.
Yeah.
And then, and it still solves the same problem. It's just that there is another way that a user might want to be able to not have to be specific and just go, well, look, why do I have to put that up there when clearly whenever that's there, one of these is here, right? So that could be something that's never implemented, but we consider a good idea. And I don't know whether it's a healthy thing to keep something in an RFC that's not going to be implemented anytime soon.
Yeah, I think also I would be, if we were going to do features, one of the things that I think about on the supply chain level falling back is, at the top of the DAG, it's like really easy to see like, oh yeah, like the workload either does or doesn't include these fields. But then as you continue traversing through the DAG, there are like later nodes that depend on an earlier node to like output something. It's not totally, actually, that's probably totally, you can probably determine that.
But that's why the supply chain makes it easy, the supply chain selection. Because once you've got the supply chain, it's only one DAG and there's no more fallback to decide on.
Yeah, I think I was
that's why
concerned
people like
that
it.
I think I was concerned that you could end up with node A create some output, and then node B, depending on whether node A, like the shape of its output, like either can or can't fulfill. But node A's output is deterministic, right? It is, if it's a source template, it's some URL and some revision, and you're kind of like quote unquote guaranteed that it's going to do that. There's no, it's not indeterminate. You don't have to wait till runtime. Cool.
Yeah, but our template technically does allow you to stamp out objects of different types. They wouldn't conform to the parent template type, but our templating does allow you to stamp out two things that are non-conformant.
Yeah, so if you're like misusing Cartographer, and you're saying, oh, later on in the supply chain, I'm going to assume that some object exists on the cluster, and I'm going to access it directly, then yeah, you could totally shoot yourself in the foot. But I think our expectation is all information that like node B needs to know from node A, it should be passed by node A as the output, like is what the template is exposing.
I wish that were true though. I wish that were true, but it isn't in the case of our it isn't exactly true in the case of delivery, because we're thinking about objects that you will read off of the cluster based on nothing more than convention. But I still don't think people are going to trip over it.
I think, yeah, and
I think this RFC is supposed to make it. This is we don't do any clever selection approach to it. This is look, it's either it is or it isn't. This is the one we will select. We've still got to select one. You will know which one you selected, and it has a very clear graph at that point. And then it's whether your supply chain made sense in the first place. All right. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's less clever, but it might be more obvious.
I'm just trying to think of a concrete example to illustrate the use case you're bringing up with Shima. And is it like, can I frame it as like in your workload, you can either define where your source comes from or where an image comes from. And like you could potentially get into the case where the first item in your supply chain would either have to be a source template or an image template. Does that illustrate your point?
My concern was, yeah, so there's the feature is exactly that. Like maybe you define, maybe you have your workload and you define source, or you define image. So exciting over here, let me tell you guys. Thanksgiving, man. So you define, yeah, you have your workload, it has some fields on it, and based on those fields, it should be very easy to say like, okay, you need supply chain A or supply chain B. And I was concerned that later in your supply chain, you have some node that's saying like, oh, I expect some output from an earlier node in the graph, and what if it doesn't give you that? And I think that we don't need to worry about that. That they will always output what, they have a contract. They're going to output, and if they don't output, the supply chain will stop. And then, I think as we said, like users could do an end run around that and say like, oh, node, this arbitrary node depends on some config map that I expect that you'll create, some cluster template. I think in fact we actually, the T example like actually does do that. And we just need to tell users don't do that. So, also, I'll just put a quick note, Rash, I totally heard you when you say like, we're not using that with the handoff between supply chain and delivery. And my hope is that as Kate's like, kind of like gets its multi-cluster story better, that we will be able to leverage some of that so that we can have some direct communication between our supply chains and our deliveries so that we don't have that implicit communication. We'll see. You're muted.
Sorry, I had always thought that it was a good bastion in our story. Like it's good to have that, but it's a separate discussion. Be interesting to know what you mean.
Cool. Last but not least, params. Worth mentioning that this also has an outstanding pull request. Shum, I don't know if you want to talk about it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one of the outstanding questions at the bottom of the pull request here is, should we use, how does the supply chain author show that the value they're providing can or cannot delegate to the workload to overwrite it? And so originally when I wrote it, it said like, oh, maybe we should just use the word default, which is already used by the templates to specify here's a default value, but I'm delegating to the supply chain to overwrite this, just using that same noun in the supply chain to say, if you use default, then you are delegating to the workload to decide whether or not to overwrite that value. And if you use the noun value, then you are saying no delegation, like I'm just specifying this. The other is to just use a flag to say, if something's overwritable, we have when you specify a value, you just explicitly write a flag, true or false, is this overwritable? And if you do, then the supply chain is delegating to the workload. Josh had written a story for the flag version. I'm pretty agnostic at this point as to which one. I'm totally open to hearing what other people think is clearer. But yeah, there's a PR and some folks have commented, and I haven't gotten a chance to read those comments because I've been commenting on other PRs this morning.
Yes. So right now, I just to level set, like workload, params, overwrite template, params, and like I'm just trying to get the hierarchy right. So, and supply chain params also overwrite template params, but we don't have like a straight hierarchy, right? And this is why you want to allow the supply chain author to like interject and say, no, use my default value, don't use the workload value, etc.
Are you saying like what is the case right now in the code base?
Right.
Right now in the code base, we're in this really weird situation where what it really is supply chains can overwrite templates. And then supply chains can use some JSON path specification to say, oh, I'm going to grab a value from the workload and like write it in here. So one of the things I was thinking over the weekend was, oh, with this change, we no longer should have that like recursive, the recursive evaluation. Like we can rip all of that out.
Yeah.
That was the one thing that required it. So yeah, right now, when you define params in your workload, it's really just that you're defining some field, and the supply chain specifies it rather than the template specifying it.
I guess
Now, go ahead.
what I want to ask is, so right now, like in the workload can overwrite or set values for the template, and then I want to ask, is there a reason that we need this flag or noun? Like, has there been a use case for it? Whereas could we not just say if the supply chain has a value, they're overriding what's in the workload? Like, can we not create some sort of hierarchy so that we don't have to use this flag?
No.
We could create a hierarchy.
So I think part of the problem is if you want to be totally flexible, right? If you think about the hierarchy of objects, then it's like you have one supply chain operating on multiple workloads. So if you want full flexibility, you need to be able to override a supply chain's decision at each individual workload.
Right. And so a workload can override the supply chain, which is that's the hierarchy, is like workload supply chain template.
Right. But there may be certain params that an operator says, I want to be able to fulfill because it's a param from the underlying template, but I don't want any of the workloads to be able to override this value.
And I'm saying, do we have an actual use case for that? Like a customer example? Like, I'm not disagreeing, but like, it's more work to put it in rather than to have a straight hierarchy.
Yeah, well, it's already in though.
It's not that much work. Yeah.
Yeah.
It does add complexity though, to Emily's point.
Yeah,
right?
complexity,
like, even
right?
If it's,
yeah. So like, it's simpler to just say like, no, if like this value set, we're going to use this. If this one set, we're going to use this, rather than having the operator have some flag that they flip on or off, whether or not a value is valid from a workload or not. I'm just asking, like, has this come up? Has a user asked for this?
So has a user asked for I, the supply chain author, want to specify a template value, and
that cannot be overridden.
That cannot be overridden.
That cannot be overridden.
That hasn't happened. And at the same time, the request for this whole feature has been asked for once. So I don't think we have. So yeah, to your point, no, we don't have a request for it. We have very limited information, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to say if the template author and the supply chain author are different personas, and of course the workload author is as well, then like there may come times when the template author is like, sure, this can be any value. And the supply chain author says like, No, in my organization, it needs to be a specific value. And
Right, so then the hierarchy then becomes templates, workload, supply chain being the top of the hierarchy. And like, that's what I'm suggesting is that we have just a straight line instead of enabling and disabling values.
so so if we take that as a reasonable scenario, the other scenario we have come across where a template says, here's a parameter that can be set, and the supply chain author didn't have control over that template and did want to be able to say, if the workload doesn't provide this value, I want to provide my own default value. So
Yeah,
we
it's
do
the
know that
default
use
case.
case has happened.
So minimally without there being flags, we could support templates providing, supply chains providing defaults, and then workloads and supply chains providing a value whereby the supply chain wins. Value separate from default, all right?
That's this use case, right?
It's very close to this use case. I think that's exactly why I didn't like the overridable flag, because it feels much more natural to the way you described the use cases. Sometimes a operator wants to provide a default. Sometimes they want to specify what it must be. When a default is provided or there is no forced value, then a workload author either has to or can provide a value. Has to when there's no default, can when there is a default. And so all of that is supported by not using the observable flag, but having a default and a value in the supply chain. And that's why I guess, because we talked about this, Josh, and it was quick and tertiary, but it was like, either or will work. And I was just surprised that we landed on using the one where there's an overridable flag without a discussion about it, because I felt like there's one that feels more natural, and it wasn't that, I guess.
Yeah, it was this one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a strong opinion either way. I guess from like talking to some other folks, they felt strongly about having an overridable flag. So that's kind of where that's coming from.
Yeah, I wonder if it
Have
would
I
be
given you
worth
any reason?
tagging them here. Yeah, so that like we get the opinions in there. Like just hearing the way that Rash put it, I'm all in on not having the flag as well.
Right. Yeah.
But I would really like to hear
Because
what they have
because
to
you
say.
know the first response I had, the first reaction I had was when I looked at it, I was like, so here's the value, but if I set this, if I set this is a value, but otherwise really it's just a default. So we're changing what the field means, but doing so by changing a Boolean somewhere else. It just feels weird, right? I mean, ultimately I'd like to have a designer chime in on this sort of thing, but still no designer on this stuff, I guess. But yeah, that would be, yeah, that's how I thought about it this morning, and that's how I responded to Washuma, and I was like, why did this end up being the one that was chosen?
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned, Rash, and I want to mirror back what I think I heard. So we have because I think I heard you put forward a third scenario. One is supply chain author says, I'm just going to specify a value. Two is the supply chain author says, I'm going to specify default and allow it to be overwritten. I think I heard you also say that there's a third case where and where it doesn't, where the template has set a default. So in the third case, you said the supply chain does not specify a value, and the workload, quote unquote, must supply a value. But I don't know that that fits conceptually with the design with the template, because the template does supply a default. We could use
Always?
this RFC to, yes.
Oh, okay.
We could use this RFC to change that and say,
Right.
oh, now
I mean,
template.
it is a third scenario, but it was just a scenario I don't see why it shouldn't exist, which is I'm waiting for you to give me this thing. There's no way I can default it, or I can default it, but you will never, like, let's put it another way. Like if your default is an empty string for a URL that must be provided, right? Then it's not going to finish. So you still must provide it. It's just that you're not going to find that out until it fails to imprint, whatever it needs to do, right? So I still think that's true, even though you can provide a default. Often the defaults are ones that don't make sense. We've seen that in some of our example chains. We've gone, in our example templates, we go, we have to provide a default, but it's going to be empty. Especially, I think, for the Git push stuff that you were doing. You don't provide a username and email. It's not healthy. It's best to leave it, right? And then have the tool complain that you didn't provide the right information. So, and that's true all the way up, I think, to the workload author in scenarios. I think there would be plenty of scenarios where you say the workload author is the only person who's going to know this. So have them provide it. Right? Or the CLI tool that they're using is the only thing that knows it. Maybe it's pushing from a local GitHub and it will just use their author name or something. But it's that kind of experience I think makes sense. And then to that reason, it just seems like the first one was the answer to the use cases, whereas the second one was, and here's an alternative, right?
Yeah, I think I'm convinced. I think it makes sense both to take out the mandatory default as well as use that default value. The default value language that I proposed originally.
No, it was your suggestion, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. I feel like it's just very domain centric, overridable. I still want to hear what people's opinion is as to why that's a domain term, right? But I don't see it personally.
So what's our next step? Because we did talk about like the whole reason that my understanding, the reason that I wrote an implementation on Friday was we want to get this in fast. So to that point, do we just say like, hey, we've had the community meeting, we've had this RFC open for a long time. We said we want to, Josh, your comment here is like 11 days ago. We want to find an implementation. Do we just say like, it's been open, we're discussing, and now we're going to roam and vote on these two options and implement one this week?
No, we need to get buy-in for the change we want to make, right? Because for the record, I totally agree. I much prefer this pattern. It makes a lot more sense to me as well. But we need more buy-in on from the VMware side to pursue this path. And I'm trying to get that buy-in, but I don't know if that's going to happen before we need to deliver this feature. So
here is, okay. This may be more, okay, I have VMware questions that maybe aren't best aired in our community meeting. So I'll hold those. And it's 2:56. So.
But yeah, other than the obvious debate between these two, were there any other questions or concerns about params in general related to this RFC?
I will say that there's, you wrote earlier that we should kind of set to the side the question of collisions in templates. I've wondered if there should be some story to make it like very clear when you that a supply chain references two templates that reference the same param, just so that somebody can do a sanity check and like look at them and be like, oh yeah, it's reasonable that these are the same param, or look at them and say like, oh no, these two authors had no idea that the other one existed, and they created a param that they both specified a param and they mean very different things in these two different templates.
Yeah. I think you called it out perfectly right here, right? That yes, it's an issue, but it's also something that we could, with a bit of supply chain magic, we could remedy, right? That's why I said we should move on without it.
When you say with some supply chain magic, the proposal that I had originally, Stephen had disliked, which was like make sure that everything like prepends the name.
Oh,
and
sorry, you also, this was your other suggestion, right? Basically remapping the name within the supply chain.
Oh yeah, which is kind of what we do right now. Oh, I suppose. Oh, we could add that as like an
additive
Yeah.
feature down the road, right?
Okay.
Which is, yeah, we could make this non-breaking, which was one of the reasons why I figured that we could we just ignore this for now.
Mhm.
Sorry, what does the remapping? The supply chain
so-
remaps.
Yeah, you could, in your supply chain, your resource that defines a param, you could say like, when it's asked for disk space, you can just say, oh,
Got it.
normally you look at the workload for this disk space thing.
Mhm.
Instead, here's the name that you should look for.
And because we're running out of time, I'll just ask you to short circuit my brain on this one. Would that work with the opposite proposal where we don't use flags? It would still be fine where we have a value at default.
Yeah.
See any yeah, okay. I just didn't want to think too hard about it if someone else
I haven't given a lot of consideration to it, but I don't see any problem with that.
All right, cool.
Cool. Well, I think that's it, and we are coming up on time. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.